Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone, and we will start in just a minute. Good evening and welcome to the Humphrey School's event on the war in Ukraine, implications for global peace and stability. I'm Mary Curtin and I'm the diplomat-in-residence and chair of the global policy area at the Humphrey School, where I teach foreign policy and diplomacy courses. And I came to the Humphrey School after a 25-year career in the Foreign Service, which included 4 years of service in Warsaw, Poland, and another 3 at the US mission to the EU, where we also worked on issues regarding the relationship between Europe and Russia. Exactly 3 weeks ago, as many of us in Minnesota were getting ready for bed, the news broke that a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine had begun. An invasion that many had predicted with precision, but that many had also hoped would not happen and indeed had worked to try to prevent. As someone who lived in Poland for 4 years, the years, in fact, during which Vladimir Putin had begun to clearly articulate his views about Russia's neighboring countries, that is, that they were not and did not deserve to be fully sovereign countries, and that he would crush any effort by them to integrate into Western European institutions, I had long come to have a healthy respect for those who said we should take those threats seriously and prepare for any eventuality. We saw Russia in recent years engage in precisely the kind of war that we are seeing now. Excuse me, I'm going to stop. Is there a sound problem? It's fine. Okay, sorry. Just wanted to make sure that people could hear. So we are seeing Russia undertake the kind of war that we saw in Chechnya and in their participation in the war in Syria. And similar to the type of war that Russia undertook against Georgia in 2008 and the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, when those countries made moves that would tie them closer to either NATO or the European Union. In the 3 short weeks since that full-scale invasion began, we've seen so many different things that it is hard to summarize them all and to try to talk about them in a short period. But we wanted to do this now to enable our students, our staff and faculty and friends of the Humphrey School to have a chance to delve a little deeper into the phenomenal things that I think we have seen on the news. The invasion itself and the shocking destruction that Russia has wrought in Ukraine in the period of 3 weeks. The strength and efficacy of the Ukrainian military, not to mention the resistance of the Ukrainian people. The unprecedented flight of millions of Ukrainians in such a short period. What is unprecedented is the speed with which that happened, and others who had been living in Ukraine into neighboring countries, particularly Poland, changing the landscape of global refugee numbers almost overnight, and the rapid response across NATO and the EU and beyond with military support and economic sanctions that many doubted would actually transpire. But as we think about that broader picture and we think about implications for global peace and security, I think that we should also acknowledge that there are brutal wars that continue in other places, such as in Yemen and in Ethiopia. And there are many people, including in Afghanistan, who are suffering the aftermath of other wars. There are tens, and Eric will be able to talk to us about this, there are tens of millions of other refugees hosted by other countries around the world, including many who are kept out of European countries. We continue to see democracy being challenged from within in our own country and in countries like Poland, even as they join the fight for Ukraine's democracy. and that in the midst of this war, there continues to be diplomacy to seek an end to it. So these are some of the issues that I and my colleagues will be discussing this evening. With me tonight, and this is the order in which they will be talking to you, are Eric Schwartz, the president of Refugees International, who is a former dean and a current member of the faculty of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and a former assistant secretary of state for population, refugees, and migration. And he'll talk about his trip to Poland last week to survey the situation of the refugees. We will then turn to Colleen Ryan, who earned her Master's of Human Rights degree from the program at the Humphrey School and College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, who was until mid-February a member of the OSCE Observer Mission in Donbass and was pulled out just before this invasion began. And finally, Dipali Mukhopadhyay, an associate professor in the global policy area at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and an expert on conflict and intervention. She is going to provide her perspectives on that big question, you know, the implications of this war for peace and security. After that, we will take questions, as many questions as we can, and we would ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box. That's how we're going to receive questions, and I will be keeping an eye on them and try to bring questions to our speakers. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Schwartz, the president of Refugees International, former dean of the Humphrey School. Welcome back to Minnesota, even if it's just virtually, Eric.
Thank you, Mary, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to screen share a map just to start the presentation, and just say that from March 3rd through March 9th, I led a Refugees International team to Poland, and we traveled about 600 miles from Warsaw. Let's see if I can get these cities up. Yes, to the city of Jeju, down into the border areas of Shemisha and the Medica border crossing. Can you see my cursor? And then we went up to the Hebrena border crossing. I'm trying to find it on the map right here. And then traveled to Lublin and the Dorohusk border crossing. So we had a pretty good sense of what was happening on the border over the course of 6 days, and we'll be issuing a report as soon as we can finish writing it this weekend. The team met with Ukrainian refugees who had just fled their homes and had crossed the border into Poland. We met with local officials, with NGO workers, with volunteers from Poland and other parts of Europe. We also had the chance, when we were in Warsaw, to meet with UN and US officials, including the US ambassador to Poland, Mark Brzezinski. As of today, upwards of, who knows, 3 million Ukrainian people have fled their homes and crossed the border into neighboring countries, with Poland hosting more than half. The refugees with whom we spoke didn't want to be outside their country of origin. Most refugees don't. Echoing the sentiments of so many Ukrainians, a woman from Zhytomyr near Kiev, whom we met in the border crossing of Dorohusk, declared that she would not have left her home but for the safety of her children. And I think she echoed, as I say, the sentiments of so many others. In many respects, the response in Poland to this crisis has been encouraging and in many respects heartening. In Poland, non-governmental organizations, local non-governmental organizations, individual volunteers have been the backbone of the effort, with local officials supporting and in many respects playing catch up. These support efforts have thus far, in large measure, succeeded in helping Ukrainians upon arrival and in moving from the border to temporary and in some cases semi-permanent residence in Poland and elsewhere in Europe. As Ambassador Brzezinski told our team, the challenge will be in sustaining this effort over time. In that respect, we can only be encouraged by the European Union's activation of a temporary protection directive that will give Ukrainian people the ability to reside and to work in EU member states for up to 3 years. I have to say that we also heard continuing and discouraging reports about disparate treatment of third country nationals on both the Ukrainian and Polish sides of the border. Excuse me. This has been a key point of discussion among the international community governments of the world and the Polish government. And I was pleased to learn that this issue is also on the agenda of Polish NGOs. And as heartening as it is, and as heartening as is the overall response to Ukrainians, as Mary alluded to, it unfortunately stands in contrast to European responses to refugees from other parts of the world, like Afghanistan, and we can talk about that. The answer is not to diminish the effort with respect to Ukrainians. The answer, of course, is to treat all refugees with the dignity that their circumstances dictate. While addressing the refugee crisis is no question a critical imperative, a far greater challenge will be meeting the humanitarian requirements within Ukraine. Even if as many as 4 to 5 million people seek protection across borders, some 40 million will remain in Ukraine. There are estimates that as many as 7 million Ukrainians may become newly displaced within Ukrainian territory. They and others who remain in their homes will need substantial help. And it's critical that those civilians who wish to flee Ukraine and obtain protection abroad must be permitted to do so in safety. So let me also address issues of international humanitarian law. That's otherwise known as the laws of warfare, and the issue of accountability. The stories we heard in a relatively small number of conversations over 6 days with Ukrainian women, and I say Ukrainian women because the overwhelming majority of the refugees are women and their families. These women raised, to my mind, presumptive evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity by the Russian military and the Russian government. At Dorohusk, one woman, her name was Nadia, showed us a photo of her children's school, which had been completely destroyed. Another woman told us of friends who were shot and killed in their cars while trying to flee. A third woman in the city of Jezu told us of a bombing of a residential building next to hers, which occurred while she and her son hid in the bathroom of their home. And these stories are so consistent with what is a rapidly accumulating and extraordinary body of information that makes very clear, to my mind, that the Russian military and government are responsible for both war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we'll be issuing a report tomorrow, the next day, when we finish, with our recommendations. But in essence, here are some ideas of ours about what should be done. First, the United States needs to be part of needs to play its role in responsibility sharing. And we feel that the president should immediately announce that he'll authorize, on an emergency basis, the resettlement of 100,000 or more Ukrainian refugees over the next 2 years. The Secretary General of the UN and interested governments, including the government of China, must press the Russian president to guarantee Ukrainian civilians safe passage to countries that will offer genuine protection for those seeking to flee. USAID and the US Office and the UN Office of Humanitarian Affairs have to accelerate their efforts to develop an assistance support infrastructure in Ukraine and prioritize aid through local organizations. The United States and other donors should direct significant financial support to the governments of refugee receiving countries, the countries bordering Ukraine, and work with national governments to ensure that aid is provided to NGOs and officials working at the local levels in each of these places. EU member states must swiftly implement the EU Temporary Protection Directive in an inclusive way to provide safety and support for anyone who needs protection, Ukrainian or otherwise, because there are a lot of third country nationals who are seeking and have left Ukraine. The Secretary General, the US Secretary of State, European governments should press Poland and other nations bordering Ukraine to ensure that non-Ukrainian nationals are treated fairly and without discrimination and have access to safe territories and adequate reception. And of course, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court should intensify the investigation relating to war crimes and crimes against humanity, which has been supported by a number of governments. And of course, the United States should support that effort. Of course, this all assumes that the war is going to continue. I mean, our fundamental recommendation is that, the Russian government should withdraw from Ukraine. But as long as that's not happening anytime soon, these are the recommendations that we'll be coming forward with.
Thank you, Eric. It's already starting to raise some questions that we'll get to after a bit. I'd like now to introduce Colleen Ryan, as I said, a recent graduate of the Humphrey School's Master of Human Rights program, who returned from service as part of the OSCE observer mission in Donbass. And we asked Colleen if she would come and provide us some of her observations about her experience there, what she saw in the time leading up to this current invasion. Go ahead, Colleen.
Thanks, Mary. As Mary said, I was part of the OSCE special monitoring mission to Ukraine. So I deployed over to Ukraine in October of 2021 as a monitoring officer. And I was specifically stationed in the Donetsk patrol hub. So I was on the non-government controlled side of the contact line for the war that was started in 2014. So our mandate to be there stems from 2014 during the Euromaidan. Our overall goal was to monitor the safety and security situation and also to help with the implementation of the Minsk agreements. So we were there to document ceasefire violations. The Minsk agreements also lay out where certain weapons can be, where they can be fired from in relation to the line of contact. And they also mandate heavy weapons holding areas that we would check on. And then we would also do some human rights work, gender and civilian casualty follow-up. So I started on patrol in Donetsk in November. The conflict overall has been pretty frozen over the last year or two. It hasn't been especially kinetic since 2016, 2017. So I was, the past couple of months, there weren't too many patrols where I actually documented a whole lot of ceasefire violations. And in the last week, that when I was there in February, I didn't record any ceasefire violations. So I left Donetsk under State Department orders February 13th. And so for that week, I didn't record any ceasefire violations while I was on patrol. And we saw a decrease in the ceasefire violations over the last month or two prior to that. Typically what we would do is we had certain routes to patrol. We would also ensure that they could make critical infrastructure repairs because often the critical infrastructure served both sides of the line, such as a water filtration station, gas. We'd help with, coordinating with ICRC for coal deliveries for the civilians, and then we do civilian casualty follow-up. Eastern Ukraine is one of the most heavily mined areas in the world right now, and the minefields aren't professionally mapped. So we often had accounts of civilians stepping on unexploded ordnance or mines. So we would follow up on that as well. So in terms of the actors on the ground, since I was on the non-government side, I was interacting with the Donetsk People's Republic soldiers, and we could tell mixed in with them, there were Russian soldiers with them. I worked with Russian colleagues. They could tell based on their Russian dialect that they were Russian soldiers not local to Donetsk. So we certainly saw Russian soldiers supplementing them. We actually had pretty good working relationships with them at checkpoints. But overall, yeah, the conflict was pretty frozen until I left. And then when the rhetoric started ramping up about a possible invasion, that's when the OSCE really started seeing an increase in ceasefire violations in the region. So around Donetsk and Lugansk, they saw a huge uptick, especially around the water filtration station that we would monitor, Avdiivka. Those were hot spots. And then ultimately the SMM made the decision to withdraw the whole mission from the country after the war had already started. So I had friends in Donetsk who had to wait probably 4 or 5 days until after the invasion where they were finally able to evacuate, and our team had to evacuate to Russia. So it was a chaotic week for them, and I'm lucky I was able to get out of there. But right now we're still waiting to see what role there will be for the OSCE once the conflict ends. I'm sure, since historically OSCE is an arms control organization, that we will be involved in monitoring a ceasefire, ensuring humanitarian corridors. I personally think we should still be there, especially in Mariupol, to ensure these humanitarian corridors. But they made the decision to withdraw, and so we'll just have to wait and see when we get to go back. Otherwise, the mandate's up for renewal at the end of March, and we'll see if the OSCE can reach a consensus to extend the mission there.
Thank you, Colleen. Your summary of what you did and what you saw just raises so many questions and so many thoughts about, the role of international organizations and the important role, international observer missions, and the important role that they play, but the limit of that if one country or another intends upon violating the agreement. And to remind listeners, the Minsk agreement was something that was negotiated in the wake of the Russian invasion in 2014 that was intended to stabilize and create conflict prevention and conflict reduction in the areas where Russia had invaded in that time, not in Crimea, but in the 2 provinces that we often see talked about in the news. Finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dipali Mukhopadhyay, who will talk a little more broadly about the implications of this war for global peace and stability. Dipali.
Thanks, Mary. I'm actually gonna cut my video because I've been told I'm getting a little shaky. So if someone can just message me as long as you can hear me, I think that's good enough. So first of all, I'm so glad that we have convened this conversation, and I'm so happy to see almost 250 people joining us, which I think reflects the alarm and horror that so many of us feel as we are watching these events unfold. I think to start, I would say, I think this is an exceptional moment in contemporary international relations for a few reasons. This is the first time since the end of the Cold War that I think we can imagine a nuclear event that could alter the shape of human history. And that, at least to me, is a pretty scary thought. It's also, I think, the closest we have come to a head-on confrontation between NATO and Russia. And as you said, Mary, it is the speed of a displacement of this side, the largest displacement in Europe since World War II, but also the fastest, the sort of velocity of it is really shocking. And I think it's also important to say that this is, in my memory, one of the most unabashed, unvarnished illegal uses of force. In contemporary international relations, there's no fig leaf of self-defense or some attempt to invoke some Security Council resolution. And as Eric said, the means by which the war is being waged reflect flagrant violations of the laws of war, again, in very sort of naked terms. And then finally, I think this remarkable demonstration of resistance on the part of the Ukrainians in the face of an invasion, and that has mobilized Western democracies in terms unprecedented since 9/11. So in all of those ways, it's an exceptional moment, which I think produces a profound sense of motivation to do something and to do more. And yet I think part of what I want to say in my comments today is that there's good reason to contend that the US and its allies should refrain from escalating intervention beyond an unprecedented regime of sanctions, financial and military aid. This show of support is not trivial by any means. In fact, it's very meaningful. But I think the risk of signaling or being inclined to go further is substantial. So I want to just think that through a little bit. There's a lot of conversation about the possibility of a no-fly zone. And I think adjectives like limited and humanitarian that precede intervention are rarely ever either limited or humanitarian when we look back on them later on. We can look from Somalia to Bosnia to Kosovo to Libya, and most often we're actually talking about complex wars that creep well past the designated mission, and they often do save lives, but they also take other lives, often for decades to come. And they're political always. So even when we describe them as humanitarian, famine and displacement are often the products, if not always the products, of politics. And so as prospective interveners, we have to acknowledge the subsequent political implications of any action that we take. Even talk of escalating beyond the current intervention produces the risk of what one of my colleagues, Alan Cooperman, has called the risk of moral hazard in this case. So those who rise up to resist will take greater risks if they believe outside help will be there to back them up. And the results are often deadly, and one only has to look at Syrians who were sure that Western enthusiasm for their uprising and horror at the terror the Assad regime rained down on them. They were certain that more decisive military action would come, and it didn't. Or the Afghans, who thought the US and its allies would look out for our partners and friends, and ultimately have fallen very far short of that expectation. And then finally, in the case of Ukraine, we're talking about an aggressor that is not a local dictator or a local insurgency. It is a nuclear-armed, veto-wielding former superpower. So the consequences of escalation go well beyond the borders and the peoples of Ukraine. They are literally global. So I think for me, what I'm hoping for is that there is a sustaining form, the sustained support from across the world for Ukraine, paired with the tenacity and the will of the Ukrainian people, that those together will give the Russians reason enough to negotiate terms with which both sides can live. And that those terms can enable a kind of coexistence at best, maybe more something like a shaky equilibrium, that will allow all sides to reset and will give the Ukrainians the space to begin to rebuild their homes and their lives after this shocking set of events. I think the last thing I'll say is that, we might also hope that this moment offers a kind of an opportunity for those who champion the liberal international order to reflect a little bit on how we got here. So there's so much discussion and debate about how did we come to this point? Some theorize that Putin's imperial fantasies of reproducing a new version of old Russia, that those fantasies are to blame. Others argue that an unbridled enthusiasm in the West for democracy promotion and alliance expansion, even regime change, proved unnecessary and ill-advised in terms of its provocation. And still others argue the opposite, that the West hasn't been bold enough, and the debacle of US withdrawal from Afghanistan, 4 years of erratic bad behavior from Washington, gave a green light to spoilers all over the world to give it their best shot. I think all of these explanations are at different moments have been very persuasive to me. And I think they're all propositions that are really worthy of our debate and study. I would also just note that this is a chance, I think, for the United States and our allies to reflect on our own infractions when it comes to the liberal international order that we claim to hold so dear. We can go back to the use of force by NATO in 1999 in Kosovo without Security Council authorization. We can look at the illegal regime change and occupation of Iraq by the US and so-called coalition of the willing. We can look at the slippage from humanitarian intervention to regime change in Libya by NATO again in 2011. And we can debate the merits and the consequences of each of those campaigns another time. But I think it's not really debatable that each of them in different ways represented an affront to the rule of law in some cases, the norms of state sovereignty, the sense that all member states of the United Nations have equal rights, equal say, and the sense that as there is a realist, consequentialist, ethical imperative to ask ourselves, will an intervention do more good than it may do harm? I think as Eric's comments revealed, Western states and societies are unfortunately inconsistent in our response to human suffering around the world. We are moved profoundly by the plights of some, especially when their misery is caused by others. But we have an opportunity here, I think, to audit our own record and recognize that all human life is worthy of dignity and sympathy. The Russian war reveals the fragility of the international order, but it also shows us what's possible when we rally together, whether it's as citizens or states or international organizations. And so that fragile but important order, in order for it to be preserved, we all need to do our part. And I think this war gives us that opportunity for reflection as well.
Thank you for that very, very thought-provoking reflection, I would call it, on some of the really deep implications of what we are seeing here. I think that we have a lot of questions that are some very specific about some details and others that get to some of those reflections, Dipali, that you just brought up about the thought about we for those of us who are Americans in this program tonight, you know, how we as Americans have operated in the world, how we see ourselves and how we see others. You know, what is the meaning of the liberal international order in its good and its bad, and you know, and how does someone like Vladimir Putin play off of the weaknesses in promoting his agenda and his approach that we are seeing in its sort of fullest form right now in Ukraine. We have a lot of really good questions. I would like to, there's the first question that came in is possibly something that's a little outside of the scope of some of the expertise of those of us that are here about how this conflict would play out in domestic politics. I'm willing to talk about that unless, Eric, you'd like to touch on that for a few minutes. You're muted.
I'm happy to. I don't have the question in front of me.
Okay, all right. So just to summarize, you know, what role do you see this conflict playing in shaping domestic politics in either the short or near term? You know, we are seeing a lot of really interesting and unpredicted or unusual positioning, but we've also seen a lot of people on both sides of the aisle come together. So the question was, you know, how do you just sort of generally a quick look at how you think this war might impact short term? I assume that means elections this fall, or longer term?
Well, I think in terms of how I'd put it I would answer your question in two ways. Number one, in terms of the kinds of issues that Dipali was alluding to, I think right now there's a very strong political consensus, bipartisan, on behalf of a strong U.S. response to what the Russians have done. I think that, you know, as this crisis goes on, we may see more and more sort of partisan dimensions there, and greater pressures from more neoconservative elements to move in a bolder way, in a more provocative way. My personal view is the administration on the geopolitics of this has had it about right. And we can talk about that. But I think that what looks like a broad consensus now, you know, could erode if the conflict continues and there are stronger and stronger calls for things like a no-fly zone. So I think that threat is there, and I think and that could emerge in the congressional elections with attacks on the current administration not being tough enough with respect to Russia right now. But I actually do believe that the administration that the foreign policy leaders of the administration now are sort of a combination of liberal internationalists who understand, you know, realpolitik, and they're trying to sort of manage, that tension. That so far, there aren't many calls in terms of the extent of U.S. Extent of U.S. opposition to what the Russians have done that I would have done differently. I'd like them to start moving a lot more briskly on giving Putin sort of an off-ramp here. I think those conversations have to start taking place, because this war is going to end one way or the other, and it can end in a bad way or it can end in a less bad way. But that's a different subject, and I feel like I've talked too long already.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to take one question that was addressed to me, and then I'm going to ask Colleen if she would take one, and then we'll circle back around again to some of those questions. So the question was, with my experience living in Poland and in light of growing Polish nationalism, how do I assess the ability of Polish society to absorb Ukrainian refugees? And I think that we've touched a little bit on and off, and I mentioned it at the beginning, that even as most Poles are very united in doing everything that they can to support Ukraine and to support the refugees, there is at the same time, in the same way that there is in this country, deep division within Poland between supporters of the current nationalist government and opponents of that government who criticize it for its restrictions on freedom of the press and its manipulation of the courts, including refusal to address some of the concerns of the European Court of Justice. And there is a potential, I think, for that conflict, which is out in the open, even as their prime minister goes to Kyiv, right, to support the president there. And there are accusations of the president, you know, taking advantage of the situation. And so right now, the Poles are incredibly welcoming of Ukrainians. Ukrainians have been moving to Poland to live there for many, many years because of various political turmoil, economic opportunity. And so many Ukrainians were able to just come right in and move in with family and friends. But I think, and Eric, you know, is the expert on this, even in countries where there is an open reception, after a while, if it puts a strain on the country, you know, that can weaken. And there are also some differences between Poles and Ukrainians. But I don't think that the new reception of Ukrainians is going to do anything to change the reaction of this current Polish government toward non-Ukrainians who are still attempting to come into Poland on the Belarusian border. And I think I think that in the same way that we have challenges to our democracy here, that that we can't forget those challenges, even as there's greater unity about how to address this current crisis. I would like to ask Colleen if she might comment on any observations that she had. We have a question about whether or not you got any sense of the citizenry there, and whether they support Ukraine versus supporting Russia versus feeling torn between. And you said, as you said, you were on the side, not on the Ukrainian government side, but on the side that was the non-government side. Were you able during your time there to pick up anything on that?
Yeah, I think what's important to remember is these are people who have been experiencing war for 8 years now. And so that has shaped a big chunk of their life. And so for a lot of them, regardless of if they had a Russian or Ukrainian passport, they just wanted the conflict to end. And we would often ask them, what passport do you have? Because in the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, they have those passports. So their Ukrainian passport is invalid, but then those passports aren't recognized and they have to get Russian passports. So they often had a couple different passports, and we would ask them what they had, and they would say, we don't care what passport we have, we just want the war to end, because there were barriers to being able to get their pensions in Ukraine, and barriers to getting aid from ICRC if their house was damaged, or they had to take long trips by bus all the way around Russia, 24 hours just to get it back into Ukraine, because the contact line crossings were shut down during COVID. So a lot of it was just a frustration with the lack of opportunity, the lack of mobility that came with living in a non-recognized territory. People my age, when I would go out to dinner, because there was still some normal life there in Donetsk, and when we would go out to dinner, we'd just talk with them, and they would say, we can't go anywhere, we're stuck in Donetsk, and because we have a DPR passport. And they were just really frustrated by the lack of opportunity, and weren't so nationalist in terms of wanting to stand by Russia or Ukraine. And I'd be really curious to see how they are now, especially because their economy there is an all cash economy and they use the ruble. So with the way the ruble's crashed, I'd be curious to see how their opinions have changed now with their economic opportunities even more limited.
Thank you. I think that your experience there is such a good reminder that, we talk about things like frozen conflicts or low intensity conflicts that deeply impact the lives of the people who are living there. It's not low intensity for them. It's not frozen for them. It's a reality that they live with every day, and that figures into the thinking about the bigger picture. There are quite a few questions, Dipali, that kind of circle around some of the things that you were talking about, that maybe are a bit about US policy, but also sort of global thinking. And I'm going to try and combine a couple here. How do we think about the US policy of democracy promotion, human rights, and stability? And then I don't know if you had a chance to listen to President Zelensky's address this morning, at the end of which he sort of made this not fleshed out idea of some kind of new global security structure. And I wonder if you might, those are two separate things. How does this current crisis impact thinking about democracy, human rights promotion? And is it time to rethink, these global structures?
Yeah, these are very big questions. I think one thing that's really important about the current moment is there's so much conversation about the thinking of the Russians and the response from NATO and the Europeans and the sort of geopolitics of it, that we don't want to lose sight of sort of centering the experience of Ukrainians themselves. And I think there are two things. One, I want to pick up on something Colleen was speaking about, is just the tremendous toll of war that war takes. And if you are sitting in Ukraine and just a few weeks ago, you were living life seemingly in a normal sense, and all of a sudden your entire world has been literally thrown upside down or destroyed. That is such a profound collective trauma to experience, and to watch the ways in which people are standing up for their way of life, which was for them, their construction of a democratic way of life that threatened Vladimir Putin for any number of reasons we can talk about. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and make clear that that's not about democracy promotion from the outside. That's not about trying to advance an American idea of liberalism. That is an indigenous set of experiences of suffering and of resistance. And I think for the Russians, I mean, they have two interesting examples. I imagine they are tossing around in their minds, one of which is the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, when people felt that an occupation merited a kind of response that went on for a long time, the consequences of which Afghans are still living with to this day, more than 4 decades later. But that for all the might of the Soviet Union, they were unable to break that will. And then you look at a different case, the experience of the Syrians who rose up against Bashar al-Assad in order to construct their own conception of a Syrian democracy, and were so brutally put down by the Assad regime with the very important critical support of the Russians, with such a degree of brutality that over time the regime was able to reconsolidate, after a decade. And so I think the question of democracy promotion, for me, what it says is that, the role of those who see themselves as promoting democracy is often quite marginal, actually, to the ultimate experience of those who are looking to construct their own versions of democracy in their countries. And they will do that at great expense to themselves and to their communities. And at some point, the toll may become too much, and they will succumb. And what is particularly terrifying about the Russian Federation's war-making approach is that it focuses on those civilian communities. It focuses on the institutions that Eric referenced, of schools, of hospitals, of maternity clinics, in order to break the will of people, so that to expect them indefinitely to persist in the service of a democratic ideal is simply an unreasonable expectation. And we hope that the balance doesn't tip that way, but I think that that's something that one fears. With respect to the changes in the international system and what will that look like, I saw also some questions in the chat about China, and we can also note that India has not taken a particularly bold stance at the moment. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting moment for thinking, as I said, about the so-called liberal international order, which I think an argument can be made was broken with the Iraq war, maybe irreparably. But even if we assume that that's not the case, I think this moment has been a real rallying cry for diplomacy, a real recognition of what multilateral cooperation on something like a sanctions regime can produce. I'm not confident that this is a move the Russians have made that the Chinese will support in a particularly meaningful way. I don't see this as their approach to geopolitics. I think it's very different. And so my guess would actually be that the Russians suffer a great deal internationally as a function of this in the medium and long term. And that raises its own set of questions and concerns about what does it mean to have a power that had imperial aspirations, that is humiliated and bankrupted and felt that it was put into a corner by the West. That hasn't worked out so well for the international order either in the past. So that's part of why the work of diplomacy and what Eric mentioned about the need for off-ramps strikes me as so important. That there are only bad outcomes here, but there are worse outcomes and less bad outcomes. And we have to try and solve for that at this point. And I actually feel quite optimistic that the international community is actually up to that at the current moment.
Great, thank you. We have so many different questions about refugee issues. And Eric, maybe I could ask you to just maybe, I'll throw a couple of them out there. One is, if we have hopes for Ukrainians to return to Ukraine, would it be better? Is it a good idea to bring them so far away, to bring them to the United States? And then many questions that really circulate around about others, other refugees in the world. How are we treating Ukrainians that come across our southern border as compared to others? And so maybe, if you have just a few more thoughts about, some of the reverberations of the refugee issues that you see out there.
I'll address those, but I just don't want to miss the opportunity to address what I think is the most fundamental issue that we're talking about here, which is what's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think whatever your views are of the existence or the future or the prospects for a liberal international order, the fact is that liberal principles, the right of individuals to choose their own destiny, to have respect for basic human rights, those principles are important and they endure. Whatever the future of the liberal international order, God forbid we have a world in which it's ruled by individuals who make decisions for the many rather than the many making decisions for their own, for themselves. And so the real question is, how do we get out of this situation? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the approach of keeping pressure, from a realist perspective, keeping pressure on the Russians, the actions of the International Court of Justice today, the possible actions of the International Criminal Court, the sanctions. I think those are all critical tools. But at some point, this war is going to end, and whether it is Putin, whether there's sort of a messianic perspective that Vladimir Putin has, or whether his perspective is just much more geopolitical about a big country that is at his border, and that in which he would like to have as somewhat of a buffer. Whatever that perspective is, at some point there's going to have to be a negotiation, unless, of course, and I very much hope, somebody deposes Vladimir Putin. But that's probably not going to happen. And so there's going to have to be some sort of negotiation in which some kind of there's an article today by a political scientist, a former UN official, Richard Wilcox, talking about a guaranteed neutrality for Ukraine, in which Ukraine has the ability to be part of the European Union in the same, and connect with Europe the way Austria has, but with a certain guarantee in military terms of neutrality. Those kinds of discussions need to be happening as long as Putin is still in power. And so I hope that there is progress, but those conversations won't happen unless the United States and its Western allies continue to maintain very firm pressure, and support for Zelensky. I mean, it is a strategy that has to combine realpolitik and liberal ideals, and it has to do so in a clever way. Now, on the refugee issue, I'll be very quick. First of all, yeah, I mean, we should not be resettling millions of refugees, Ukrainian refugees in the United States. We're calling for the resettlement of 100,000 over 2 years. That's about 1 to 2% of the refugees who are likely to be crossing borders. So we're not talking about a huge U.S. commitment. But if you simply restrict that to Ukrainians who have family ties in the United States, you'll probably get to about 100,000 or more. And nothing prevents those people from going back to Ukraine when the circumstances and the situation permits. So yeah, I mean, I understand we don't want and people should get to choose where they want to go. I mean, nobody's going to force any Ukrainian to resettle in the United States. But my most important point is we're talking about a tiny fraction in terms of what we're advocating. I think, I called for the resettlement of 100,000 Syrians in the United States 5 years ago. I think that the answer is not to look at the generosity of the response with respect to the Ukrainians and say, we can't be generous with the Ukrainians because we're not generous with the Syrians or the Afghans. The answer is we need to be generous with population groups, regardless of the color of their skin, their ethnicity, their background. And that's what we're saying in our reporting on Ukraine. And that's what we're saying on our reporting in Syria. And that's what we're saying. And that is the principle of humanity. The principle that every individual who is in need, whose rights are being violated, should command the attention of humankind. Again, no matter what the color of their skin, their background, their affinity, whatever. And I think that really is the perspective that my organization is trying to advance and that I've tried to advance.
Thank you. And I would like to also add, to go back to the larger issues. I think that that one of the real problems with the way the United States has operated in the world for the last 20 or 30 years, I think that the invasion of Iraq was this sort of moment that broke a lot of things. But the United States is not a member, for example, of the International Criminal Court. And yet, at times, we call for people to be brought to the International Criminal Court. And so I think when we're talking about new approaches to global institutions and how we think about those, there is also the question of how the United States operates in the world and is willing not just to pay lip service to some of these organizations, but to actually take the risk of belonging and to say, yes, we are going to join. And we are going to take what that means when we join. And I think that, going forward, many of these issues are difficult. Living in Poland for 4 years gave me a very deep and profound understanding of why countries like Poland and the Baltics and Ukraine want there to be a NATO and want to be members. And it was something I hadn't really deeply understood until I lived and worked there and saw the deeply historically rooted and realistic and rational fear that those countries had, that this thing could come back again. But I personally think that the United States also has many ways in which it needs to think about how it operates in the world. We are at the end of our hour here, and I think we could go on for much longer. There are so many good questions that are there. This was meant to be a bit of an overview and a bit of thinking about the specifics of the situation as it is right now, to hear the experience of Eric and Colleen on the ground in Ukraine and in Poland. It's hard to imagine, Colleen, that you were in Ukraine just a month ago. As you said, living and going about an ordinary life, such as it was there. And Dipali, thank you so much for your really thought-provoking insights into, sort of the broader global ramifications of this current event. Both the frightening ones, the danger of nuclear war, but also the hopeful ones about, the way that we've seen countries come together to legitimate Ukraine's aspirations to be its own country and not to have to endure what it is enduring. So I hope that you will all join us again. I suspect we'll be coming back to this conversation, hopefully in the not too distant future, to be talking about what that off-ramp or that negotiated settlement can be. And so thank you all for joining us here this evening. I hope that we'll be having in-person events soon, but I'm happy that those of you who are not here in the Twin Cities were able to join us. So on behalf of the entire Humphrey School community, thank you, Eric, Colleen, and Dipali for joining me here this evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.